Hi friends, welcome to the Shadow Post 47 YouTube channel, to the world of real wars, where reality is more unbelievable than any story. Today we're going to dive into one of India's most complex intelligence operations that ended up saving a country.
The Maldives, an archipelago of turquoise waters, white sand beaches, and quiet diplomacy, was never known as a battlefield. But beneath the calm waves and idyllic palm trees, a silent crisis was brewing. It was 1988. Unknown to the outside world, a coup was being plotted, one that would shake the Indian Ocean and test the limits of India's intelligence capabilities. At the heart of this gathering storm was Maumoon Abdul Gayoom, president of the Maldives for a decade. Educated in Egypt and the West, Gayoom maintained a pro-India stance, and had stabilized the country after years of political turbulence. But power breeds enemies. Dissidents had been exiled. Opposition had been silenced. And in the shadows, those exiled were preparing for their return, by force. Far away, in Sri Lanka, a mercenary group known as Plot, the People's Liberation Organization of Tamil Eelong, had lost relevance in the civil war. They were battle-hardened, desperate for funds, and willing to sell their services. An alliance was born. Abdullah Luthufi, a disgruntled Maldivian businessman in exile, struck a deal with Plot to overthrow the Maldivian government in exchange for money, influence, and safe haven. The plot was brutal in its simplicity: infiltrate Mali, the capital city, with armed mercenaries. Take control of key government buildings. Capture or assassinate President Gayoom. Install Luthufi as the new head of state. But even the best-laid plans leak. The eyes and ears of India's research and analysis wing, RAW, had been monitoring regional activity closely. The agency had long been concerned about foreign mercenary operations in Sri Lanka spilling into neighboring states. But something about recent Plot movements raised red flags. Intercepted chatter. Suspicious travel patterns. An uptick in encrypted communications between Tamil operatives and contacts in the Maldives. There were whispers of arms deals, foreign currency transfers, sudden passport activity. RAW's southern desk sent a quiet alert to New Delhi: movement detected. Possible paramilitary mobilization. Target unclear. Recommend continued surveillance. But Gayoom, perhaps sensing something, also sent out 3 desperate messages to the Indian government. Not once, not twice, but thrice, he reached out in private channels, requesting military assistance in case of an emergency. The third message, classified and hand-delivered to South Block, ended with a line that chilled the Indian national security apparatus: if I fall, the archipelago falls. And with it, the Indian Ocean. The silent infiltration, October 1988. Under the cover of civilian ferries and fishing boats, over 80 Tamil mercenaries began infiltrating the Maldives. They smuggled weapons, explosives, and radio equipment. Their instructions were precise: avoid civilian casualties, neutralize resistance, move fast. On the night of November 2nd, the final wave entered Mali. By 3 a.m., key checkpoints were compromised. Government soldiers were outnumbered. The presidential palace was under siege. Power was cut in parts of the capital. Smoke rose from a radio tower. Panic spread like wildfire through the narrow alleys of Mali. But President Gayoom was still alive, hidden in a safe location. And more importantly, his line to India was still open. In New Delhi, at the Prime Minister's office, a secure phone line buzzed to life. Gayoom's voice trembled: "They're here."
When politics, power, and espionage come together, the result is exactly the kind of video you're watching right now.
The coup is happening. I need your help, now. India had to decide, and decide fast. Would it risk soldiers, for a tiny neighbor? Would it intervene in a sovereign state's affairs? Would it allow foreign mercenaries to dictate power in its maritime backyard? RAW's chief, alongside the Indian military's top brass, gave their answer without hesitation. Launch the operation. End of Part 1 to be continued in Part 2, Operation Cactus, when spies mobilize. Where we dive into India's lightning-fast military response, the secret war room, the para-commandos, the risky night airlifts, and the dramatic takedown of the mercenaries on foreign soil. November 3, 1988. At 3:30 am, in the silent corridors of India's South Block, the heart of national security, a red phone rang. On the other end, President Maumoon Abdul Gayoom, alive, barely, and under siege. Mali is overrun. They've taken the TV station, the airport, and government offices. I'm trapped. Please help us. By the time the phone went silent, New Delhi was already awake. The call triggered a chain reaction across the Indian defense and intelligence ecosystem. Within minutes, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, National Security Advisor Gopi Arora, the chiefs of RAW, IB, and the armed forces were in an emergency war room meeting. Time was not on India's side. The situation on the ground on the streets of Mali, chaos ruled. Armed cloak mercenaries, dressed in civilian clothing, had seized major installations. The Maldives National Security Service, NSS, was outnumbered, outgunned, and overwhelmed. The mercenaries roamed the streets in jeeps, automatic rifles, slung over their shoulders. At least 80 operatives had landed, with more waiting offshore on boats. They had taken control of the Maldives radio station, silenced broadcast signals, and replaced them with martial instructions in Divi. Gunfire echoed across the capital. The coup, however, was not flawless. President Gayoom had evaded capture in a carefully planned escape, moving across safe houses inside Mali. But his exact location remained uncertain even to Indian officials. Any delay in response could mean his assassination. The stakes were lethal. If the president was killed or captured, the mercenaries could install a puppet regime instantly, backed by a declaration.
If you think intelligence agents are only heroes in the movies, this operation will change your mind.
Over seized media. To prevent that, India needed to act not in hours, but in minutes. RAW's Precursor Moves. Before the military was fully mobilized, RAW was already in motion. The agency had field assets in Colombo, Mali, and Tiruvananthapuram, and had flagged Plot's movements in the weeks prior. Senior RAW officers coordinated a crash analysis of potential landing sites, enemy movement, and diplomatic risk. One crucial piece of intel emerged from a RAW contact in Colombo: 2 vessels are anchored off Maldivian waters. Likely the extraction route for Plot fighters after the coup. If true, that meant India had a narrow window before the mercenaries fled with hostages or the president. RAW also liaised with Maldivian intelligence loyal to Gayoom, confirming that the airport was not fully secured by the attackers. This one detail, unverified but vital, would influence the next decision. The military response begins by 4:30 am, orders were issued. Operation codename, Cactus. Lead branch, Indian Air Force, IF Ground Force, Parachute Regiment, 50, Independent, Parachute Brigade, Agra Supporting Intelligence, RAW, ME, IB Logistics Base, Agra Air Force, Station Air Assets, 2 Ilyushin IL-76 heavy lift aircraft, capable of moving paratroopers and gear in hours. By 7 a.m., over 300 commandos were being rushed onto airstrips in Agra. Many had been pulled from their bunks. No one knew their destination, until the mission brief was unsealed mid-air. The paratroopers, elite veterans of high-risk insertions, were ordered to perform a combat landing on a foreign island, with little intel, no air support, no artillery backup, and no margin for error. The flight that changed the Indian Ocean, the Il-76s roared into the skies before breakfast. The flight path took them from Agra to Tiruvananthapuram, Kerala, then straight south into the heart of the Indian Ocean. As the planes thundered over the dark waters, commandos reviewed satellite maps and photographs taken from raw archives. The plan was daring: land at Males Hull Airport under partial control of the mercenaries, secure the airstrip, and spread out into the city to neutralize threats and rescue the president. But there was a problem. Males Airport was built on a separate island, accessible only by ferry or speedboat, to the capital proper. That meant India's paratroopers would have to secure an isolated airstrip, then conduct an amphibious insertion into Mali, with enemy forces already entrenched. RAW had advised of possible foreign observers monitoring the event: China, Pakistan, and even rogue Gulf contacts with links to mercenaries. A failed operation would not just embarrass India, it could destabilize its entire maritime strategy. Despite the odds, Indian forces moved forward. Touchdown enemy territory time, 3:45 p.m., November 3, 1988. The first IL-76 circled low over Mali. Smoke plumed from the harbor. Sporadic gunfire could be seen in the distance. Air traffic control had been restored for minutes, thanks to loyalists within the Maldivian military. The window was razor thin. The Indian commandos landed. Within 20 minutes, the airstrip was secured. No major resistance. Some mercenaries had retreated into the city, while others were unaware of what was coming. Commando teams split immediately, some moving to the harbor, others toward the president's suspected safe house, and a third toward the TV station and communications hub. By nightfall, close quarters combat erupted in the narrow streets of Mali. Indian paratroopers engaged mercenaries in door-to-door fighting. Some cloaked fighters fled the capital entirely, heading toward the anchored vessels offshore. One group attempted to take hostages, including foreign nationals. Indian forces intercepted them at the ferry terminal. A brief, intense gunfight ended with the mercenaries dead and the hostages freed. By 11 p.m., the city was declared secure. The high seas chase, a final chapter of the operation, was still unfolding at sea. The fleeing mercenaries had boarded a Maldivian cargo vessel, hoping to disappear into Sri Lankan waters. But India had already alerted its navy. Two warships, the INS Godavari and INS Betwa, were diverted and ordered to intercept. The Indian Navy intercepted the vessel after a high-speed pursuit, boarded it, and captured 19 fleeing mercenaries, including key lieutenants of plot and suspected foreign handlers. The prisoners were returned to Mali.
Did you see what happened? It was just a few hours and a quarter away from the country, just a few hours.
And many were later handed over for prosecution. Victory without glory. By dawn on November 4th, the tricolour flew beside the Maldivian flag on government buildings. President Gayoom emerged from hiding, shaken but alive, addressing the nation with trembling hands. India has saved the Maldives. We are forever in your debt. End of Part 2, to be continued in Part 3, The Aftermath, Echoes of a Silent Victory, in which we explore the global reaction, geopolitical consequences, India's expanding maritime doctrine, and what history chose to forget. November 4, 1988. The sun rose over Mali to the sound of silence, not of defeat, but liberation. Indian paratroopers, boots dusty and rifles still warm, patrolled the narrow streets of the capital. The stench of gunpowder clung to the air. Doors creaked open. Civilians emerged, eyes wide with uncertainty, slowly realizing the mercenaries had fled or been captured. Inside the presidential palace, Maumoon Abdul Gayoom, exhausted but alive, met the commander of the Indian operation and the ambassador from New Delhi. "You did not just save me," he said, voice low, "you saved our nation." Tensions behind closed doors. While the streets of Mali were returning to normal, behind closed doors, the real battle was just beginning, the geopolitical one. India had done the unthinkable, launched a rapid response military intervention in a sovereign country, completed it in under 24 hours, without UN approval, and with no regional consultation. The West was stunned. The global press, only beginning to learn the details, struggled to process the speed and scale of the operation. In Islamabad, Pakistani generals watched the news with clenched jaws. A successful, unilateral operation in South Asia without their input was a blow to their regional influence. Worse, India had proven it could project power across the Indian Ocean. Islamabad issued a cautious statement urging restraint and regional dialogue, but the message was clear: India had redrawn the lines. In Beijing, China's reaction was even more calculated. The Maldives was considered part of China's emerging string of pearls strategy, a series of ports and influence zones to counter India's dominance at sea. The failed coup meant India had stopped a domino before it could fall. Chinese officials avoided public comment, but internal memos warned of India's increasing willingness to use military power preemptively. What the world didn't see, what global headlines missed, was the invisible war beneath the surface, the war of spies, networks, and silent influence. Raw's counter-operations did not end with the rescue. Intelligence officers remained in Mali for weeks afterward, assisting the Maldivian government in interrogating captured mercenaries, tracking foreign money trails, and shutting down hidden sympathizers in local institutions. One RAW officer later remarked, "The coup was just the surface. What we found underneath was foreign fingerprints." Documents seized from Plot operatives revealed bank transfers from Gulf sources, encrypted messages suggesting prior consultation with external intelligence handlers, and even potential contacts in Colombo linked to political patrons. While India never officially accused another nation, RAW's files quietly marked the operation as not just a mercenary action, but a proxy intervention disguised as rebellion. The fate of the mercenaries, the captured mercenaries, nearly 24, were handed over to Maldivian authorities. But the legal aftermath was complex. The Maldives had no real precedent for dealing with international terrorism. With Indian legal assistance, a tribunal was set up. Most were sentenced to long prison terms. Abdullah Luthufi, the exiled Maldivian businessman who orchestrated the plot, evaded capture, believed to have found refuge in Sri Lanka or further afield. Years later, a former Indian Navy officer claimed, "We knew where he was. But some ghosts are better left haunting the ocean." Strategic ripples in the Indian Ocean Operation Cactus wasn't just a military success, it was a strategic blueprint. It sent a message to the entire Indian Ocean region: India will not wait. India will act. And India will not tolerate instability on its maritime borders. This single operation reshaped India's naval and strategic doctrine. It catalyzed the formation of integrated theater commands, expanded India's island surveillance network, and led to increased Indian presence in Mauritius, Seychelles, and Madagascar. The phrase Indian Monroe Doctrine began appearing in diplomatic circles, referring to a policy where India considered any external interference in its neighborhood as unacceptable. Diplomatic fallout and silent gratitude. In New York, The United Nations received a letter of notification from the government of India, after the operation was completed. It explained that the intervention was made at the request of the legitimate Maldivian government. There was no time, the letter said, to go through formal channels. It was a humanitarian rescue. The response was muted. Most nations, including the United States, issued formal acknowledgements and moved on. But among regional allies, India's standing rose sharply. Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, even Gulf monarchies, recognized that India could act decisively, without leaving fingerprints of recklessness. President Gayoom never forgot what happened. For years after, every major Maldivian delegation to India would begin their speeches by recalling the night the Indian commandos came. Legacy of Operation Cactus. Operation Cactus is taught today in military academies across the world, not for its size or its bloodshed, but for its precision, speed, and geopolitical impact. It was a moment when intelligence worked faster than chaos. Military force moved before diplomacy collapsed. And a tiny island nation was saved not by chance, but by deliberate choice. To this day, no Indian soldier who participated in Operation Cactus lost his life. And perhaps that is its greatest triumph, a war that ended before it began.